Welcome, I'm Glenn Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glenn's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glenn's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glenn's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch. This month's interview on Glenn's Parallax Perspectives provides fresh information and insights into prison sentences. Besides discussing several problems about felony sentencing and imprisonment, we will also discuss some solutions that deserve more public awareness and support and implementation. So even if you are already well informed about felony sentencing, you will learn a lot more from this interview. If you're not already well informed, you'll learn a lot and you'll enjoy meeting with our expert guest. I'm happy to welcome Nazgul Ghanoush. She earned a PhD in sociology and wrote her doctoral dissertation about reducing long prison sentences. She works for a nonprofit organization, the Sentencing Project, where she conducts research on criminal justice policies. She's written about racial disparities in the justice system, public opinion about punishment, and the scope of reform efforts, and other stuff too. These are the things that we will be getting into in this topic, in this program. Her latest report is titled A Second Look at Injustice. This is a comprehensive analysis of a growing and powerful tool to curb mass incarceration, the excessive imprisonment of people. The second look concept is a set of policies that enable extreme sentences to be re-evaluated. In about 30 minutes, we'll discuss the second look remedy that she has researched and written about. And before that, we'll get into a bunch of other good stuff that I'm happy to inform you about. She writes extensively and speaks to a variety of professional audiences. Welcome, Nazgul. I'm glad that you are here.
Thank you, Glenn. Great to be here with you.
And we'll have a good time, and the people watching the program will have a good time, even though we're discussing a serious topic. In the 1960s, a huge number of Americans started opposing longstanding racial injustices. The civil rights movement was making progress, and bit by bit, mainstream public opinion was shifting toward recognizing, yeah, this racial injustice culture that we have has problems and we need to reverse that. But then for a few years, starting in 1965, when the riots occurred in many American cities, some people started moving against the racial justice movement and started clamping down again. Richard Nixon and some other prominent politicians who were insensitive to racial injustice reframed the issues as a breakdown of law and order, in quotation marks, in order to make white Americans afraid of Black Americans and to stop the civil rights movement. Then for several decades, the US experienced politicians rising to power with, quote, tough on crime, unquote, platforms that especially aimed at hurting racial minorities. Federal and state laws were passed that criminalized more behaviors and imposed longer sentences. And we went through that for a period of time, and now we're kind of emerging out the other end of it, thanks to work from Nazgul and the Sentencing Project and other good organizations and people working for smart reforms. Before we explore the specific problems or solutions, Nazgul, would you summarize overall political climate of those decades regarding crime and felony sentencing. What else would you add to what I've said?
Sure. I think what you said really captured a lot, and it reminded me of the current political climate that we're finding ourselves in. But just to go back and recap, if you were to describe numerically the history that you just recounted, what that amounted to was a massive growth in the prison population in the United States from 1972, when there were roughly 200,000 people in prison in the United States, until the prison population reached its peak level in 2009 at 1.5 million people. So that's a 700% increase during that time. And we'll talk a little bit later about what's happened since then and how we've started to reduce the prison population since then, relatively modestly. But that is a really dramatic growth. And it's really notable because when you consider patterns in other countries, you see that the United States, like other countries, experienced an uptick in crime in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And then since then, since the 1990s, crime rates have really been falling quite a lot. But we've continued to increase incarceration levels since then. And that's really anomalous because many other countries experienced a similar uptick and then downturn in crime rates. But we're the only country that came up with a solution of mass incarceration to address our crime problem and continued to pursue that solution even as crime rates were falling.
Yeah, many other modern industrial wealthy countries do a lot more toward rehabilitation, very smart ways of corrections. I know Scandinavian countries have done some really good things. Let me show two graphs that you brought up. Is that, let's see, oops, I need to do it in a different way. Hold on a second. There it is. Can you tell us, this illustrates what you told us about.
Yeah, this is shows the massive increase in the prison population. And, some people might remember that there's a figure of 2.2 million incarcerated people in the US. And you get to that number by adding in the jail population.
Local jail.
That's right. So this is just people in prison who are serving sentences typically of 1 year or longer. And you can see the dramatic increase and how much we have to still work to make a bigger dent in these numbers if we want to reduce our incarceration levels.
Right. Let me show this other one that you provided that compares internationally what's happening. This is our per 100,000 population.
Yep. And this is the rate of incarceration per 100,000 residents in the United States. So it accounts for our population size. So you can see how much higher US's rate of incarceration, over 600 per 100,000 people, is compared to other industrialized countries. Like, look at Canada, lower down, it's at about 100 per 100,000. France is even lower, Germany.
Wow.
We're closer to other countries that we don't typically consider ourselves peers with, right? We don't think of ourselves as a peer country with Rwanda. We think of Russia as having a lot of problems, and yet we have a much higher incarceration rate than Russia.
Almost twice as high as Russia. So,
yep.
When you look at other indicators of human rights, the United States is down the list in a number of ways as well. A lot of the injustices in the prison system and sentencing system occur because people assume some things that are not true. People do not have the information that they need in order to make smart decisions here. And many people assume that long prison sentences deter crime. And can you tell us, Nazgul, what the actual research shows about that as assumption about long sentences deterring crime?
Sure, absolutely. So, and let me first explain why that's such an important question, because one of the reasons we have a mass incarceration problem in the United States and we have so many more people in prison in our country compared to our peer countries is because of long sentences. It's not just It doesn't have to do with, one of the underlying factors is we do have a higher level of violent crime, and in particular gun crime, which we need to address. But even if you accounted for that, we still have way more people incarcerated than other industrialized countries. And that's because partly of the drug war. It's partly because the likelihood of going to prison has gone up so much compared to in the past, where you might have gotten a community supervision sentence for something. But also lastly, and that's what we're going to focus on now, when you get sent to prison, you get sent to prison for such a lengthier period of time compared to in the past and compared to other nations. So recently there have been these trips that have been organized where American prison officials and criminal justice reform leaders visit Germany or the Netherlands, and they visit prisons in these places. And some of them describe how people come up to them and say, this is what I did here. This is what I'm convicted of. This is my sentence. How long do you think I would have gotten in the United States for this crime? And they're just astonished to learn that in the United States, you would get such a lengthier sentences for that exact same offense. And so one of the reasons we have mass incarceration is because of very lengthy sentences here. And the way that we got there is that policymakers passed mandatory minimum laws. They passed what are called so-called truth in sentencing laws, requiring people to serve lengthier periods of their sentence before they can be released. And the idea here is that, well, if you can keep people behind bars longer, we'll be safer in our communities. But unfortunately, as we describe at the Sentencing Project, long sentences they're not just ineffective, they're counterproductive to the goal of advancing public safety. And that's because of a couple of different reasons. First, it has to do with the fact that long sentences are not effective at deterring people from committing crime because most people don't expect to get caught. They're not thinking about being caught sometimes if they're committing their crime under the influence of drugs and alcohol. There's an underlying problem there that we need to address rather than threatening people with very long sentences. And in fact, that's not an unreasonable expectation to not get caught. Recently, in I think it was July 2022, the CBS put out an analysis of clearance rates, how often someone is arrested for a crime. And they looked at this specifically for murder, which is a crime that we would expect to see the highest clearance rates for. And clearance rates for homicides have come down to roughly 50% during the pandemic. Half the time that someone is killed, no one is arrested for that offense. Wow. So that's one issue. Long sentences are not effective because people don't expect to be caught. And criminologists have said that increasing the certainty of being punished is more important than increasing the severity of punishment. The other two factors related to this is that people age out of criminal activity. Most people don't commit crime 10 years after their initial crime. And so when you're incarcerating people for beyond a decade, you're incarcerating people who do not pose a public safety risk. And then the final point is that when people are incarcerated for very long sentences, that's a population that is extremely expensive to incarcerate because they get older, because of their healthcare needs are greater. And if someone has to go off-site, for example, for a hospital visit, they have to be accompanied by several guards. And that is all money that we could be spending much more effectively to advance public safety rather than incarcerating people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond.
Yeah. When I talk with people about this, I say that what these long sentences do is we are sentencing taxpayers to waste a huge amount of money to imprison people who are no longer a threat to society. So it's really a sentencing against the taxpayers for wasting money, as well as sentencing the families to be broken up. Because it's one thing if you're in prison for a short amount of time, then you can come back and get your family going again. But if you're in prison for a long period of time, you break up the family. And as a society, we like to think about, oh, as a society, we care about families. No, we don't. We break families up by these kinds of policies. I want to have you talk a bit further about specifically life sentences. The past few decades of tough on crime mania has caused a lot of people to be serving life sentences beyond just the long sentences. And when we were preparing for this interview, you told me that more than 200,000 Americans, a seventh of all prisoners nationwide, are serving life sentences. And you told me that in Washington State, where I live, 19% of the people in Washington State's prisons are serving life sentences. So I want to show some graphs on the screen if I can bring them up and find them. You know what these graphs are because you provided them. Can you share that, and I'll get these graphs.
Yeah, so we at the Sentencing Project keep track of how many people in prison are serving life sentences, and those are life sentences with or without the possibility of parole, as well as what are considered virtual life sentences that are 50 years or longer. And so we found that it's roughly 200,000 people now in prison are serving life sentences. That's 1 in 7 people, every 7 people in prison is serving a life sentence. And so that really highlights the extraordinary high rates of extreme punishment that we have in the United States. And one of the things that we really emphasize is that if we want to end mass incarceration, we have to scale back very long sentences, and including our recommendation is ending life imprisonment completely. A number of our industrialized peers have moved away from life imprisonment completely. We have not even completely ended life without parole sentences for youth. We still allow those sentences for some youth, though we've significantly scaled that back. But it's really an example of, these are crimes that typically the most, are serious violent crimes. Most people who committed, who are serving time for life sentences are serving time for a murder conviction. But we really need to understand that even these individuals who've caused one of the greatest forms of harm that we can imagine in our communities, even these individuals age out of criminal activity. And after they've spent 10, 15, 20 years in prison, we should recognize that if they're no longer a public safety risk, we should bring them back into our communities and better invest the money that we're spending on incarceration to do something better, more effective, to prevent other people from experiencing the same kind of harm and trauma. So the chart that you have there on the top right shows the dramatic increase in life imprisonment in the United States. And we as an organization recommend limiting most prison terms to 20 years for people.
Yeah, and the graph on the left, it's hard to read the small print, but the short red vertical bar chart is life with parole. This goes back from the expansion from 2003 to 2020. There were relatively few life with parole, but you'll see a huge number of life without parole sentences. And then the pie chart on the bottom there shows percent of life sentenced population who are 55 and older. And you'll see there's looks like about a 30% that are aged 55 or older serving life sentences. And those people are not a danger to society.
Right. Overwhelmingly, those people are not likely to be a danger to society. And we can see that when we look at people who have been released from prison on life sentences. That is a population that has some of the lowest recidivism rates among anyone that's released from prison. And so they're a very clear example of the successes that we would have if we expanded release mechanisms for people who have served lengthy sentences.
Yeah. And I remember this popped in my head just now. I remember decades ago when George Wallace was the hardcore right-wing governor of Alabama, and what he did is he had servants, serving in the governor's mansion, servants, personal servants for him, and he chose to have servants he didn't have to pay because they were prisoners. They were actually convicted of murder, and they were serving in his governor mansion as his personal servants. So even though he was a tough on crime, law and order freak who ran for president in '68 on a racist tough on crime platform, he actually knew better than that in his heart. And later, before he died, he finally repented of his racism, and a lot of people don't remember that. I want to, can you tell us about, people assume that crimes are violent crimes, but there's a lot of crimes that do not have violence involved. These could include just a theft, burglary, drug crimes. Those have been prominent. Can you tell us about that? And I'll try and show a share screen about felony sentences about crimes not involving violence. But can you Tell us
Sure.
about the violent crime, excessive sentences, and then nonviolent crimes.
Sure. So when we think about the prison population, I always encourage people to think about what proportion of the prison population do you think has a violent conviction versus a nonviolent conviction? So if you were to sort of go through this thought exercise and come up with an estimate, a lot of folks have an impression that most people in prison are there for a nonviolent crime, but actually more than half of people in prison have a violent conviction. And those violent crimes include crimes like robbery, which is always considered a violent crime, assault, as well as the more serious violent crimes like rape and homicide. When we're talking about the lengthiest sentences, we're talking about the most serious violent crimes. But overall, when we think about the whole prison population, it's important to remember that their lower level violent crimes are very prevalent as well. And so if we want to end mass incarceration, we really have to get to the point where we're thinking about how many people are in prison for violent crimes and what period of time they're serving. We can't end mass incarceration just through reforms that focus on nonviolent crimes. Now, a significant portion of people in prison are there for nonviolent crimes as well. So that includes drug offenses, and it also includes property crimes. So that's what you see, especially at in state prisons. When you look at federal prisons, you also see a larger proportion of people that are there for immigration law violations as well.
Yeah, and the top graph here compares 1980 in the gray bar chart and 2019 in the red bar chart. State prisons is the first pair of vertical bar charts, federal prisons, and then jails, where the red shows 2019 data. And this is prisons and jails for drug offenses. And you can see the massive increase. And if somebody has a drug problem, they need some treatment. They need to be able to function in their lives without dealing with drugs, without using drugs or selling drugs. And instead of healing people and rehabilitating and providing services and healthcare that they need, we throw them in prison and make the taxpayers suffer for their drug use instead of solving the problem.
Yeah, that's right. And so let me say, the charts that you showed show the dramatic increase in the number of people that are incarcerated for drug law violations. In prison, that would especially be people who are convicted of selling drugs. And a lot of times those people have a substance use problem that they're trying to maintain, and that's why they're selling drugs.
Right.
And so if we made sure that anyone that has a drug use problem in our country has immediate and free access to effective drug treatment, we'd be in a very different place. And beyond what is shown in those charts there, we know that a lot of people commit property crimes and even violent crimes while under the influence of drugs or alcohol, related to and because of substance use problem. And so those kinds of crimes we could also tackle as well and reduce if we made sure that there was universal access to effective drug treatment.
Right. And I know from things I've read and studied before, there's some limited window of time where somebody says, geez, I've got to kick this habit. I want to get some help. And then they go to some agency to say, can you help me kick the drug habit? And they say, well, we'll put you on a waiting list and maybe 6 weeks we'll have a space for you in our treatment program. When somebody is at that moment in that window of opportunity where they want to kick the habit, they should get immediate help. They should immediately be able to get into treatment, get the health care, the rehabilitation that they need. Because if they're on a waiting list for 6 weeks or something, they'll be back in the habit again. And
that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. So these laws that we have are set up with the sense of punishing instead of solving the problems. And it's just bad politics.
That's right. It's bad politics. It sort of is emotive, and that makes people feel good to send away people and be harsh on people that are having these problems instead of actually getting to the root problem. And even when someone is incarcerated, that's a situation where you would think we would, if we're gonna lock someone up and they have a drug problem, let's make sure that they have access to some of the best drug treatment possible, because we found it necessary to take away their liberty. And
Yeah.
yet most institutions around the country do not offer access to effective drug treatment, to professional drug treatment. If you have an opioid use problem, many places around the country, you are not able to access medication-assisted therapy if you're incarcerated. And so this, in fact, exacerbates the opioid problem, for example, that we have in the United States, because when people are incarcerated for either a short or lengthy period of time, and sometimes lose access and often lose access to the drugs, though not always, when they're incarcerated, when they're released and they continue their use, and they sometimes continue at the same level that they had been using before their incarceration, researchers have shown that they're especially high risk of overdose death in that situation. And so that's a situation where we're creating a cycle of churning people in through the system and letting them out worse off than when they started.
Right. And again, I keep seeing data about excess deaths in the United States from overdoses, and that other countries don't experience because they have better, they do what's referred to as harm reduction. So if you have an addiction, here we say, oh, that's a crime, we'll lock you in prison. Other countries say, oh, if you have an addiction, let's find ways that we can reduce the harm reduction programs, needle exchanges, safe places to do your thing until you can kick the habit. Here, we don't want to solve the problem. We just want to throw them in prison and make the taxpayers pay for not solving the problem. Also, we have big pharmaceutical companies that have made a lot of money with these opiates, and they are largely responsible for promoting them. So the big drug dealers are big pharma companies, and Congress lets them get away with that. I want to shift a bit into another factor that we've mentioned. In our society, in this country, racial disparities occur throughout every sector of society, certainly in the criminal justice system, but also in different aspects of our economic system, housing, exclusions, and all kinds of stuff. A lot of white people jump to conclusions about race matters that are not valid because people don't know the important facts, or they've been kind of herded into a racist back alley of baloney. There's a stronger word than baloney that I wanted to say, but I'll settle for baloney. But these stereotypes exist in a bunch of ways, and one stereotype is that Black people tend to kill white people, but actually the victims of homicide disproportionately are Black people. And I know that you have insights and information about that. Can you share that?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because one of the issues that we know we have in terms of racial inequality in our country is that Black Americans are most likely to be victims of serious violent crime. And in particular, most likely to be victims of homicide. And so what that means is a couple of different things. One thing that means is, because homicide is generally a crime that's intraracial, people generally kill other people of the same race or ethnicity, that means that there's a higher rate of homicide offending among African Americans compared to whites. And that has everything to do with all the inequalities that we see in our society that makes it more likely for Black people to live in urban cores, in concentrated urban poverty. If you somehow flip the script in our society and you had Black people living in McMansions in the suburbs and white Americans overwhelmingly poor, living in dense urban areas, you would have a higher rate of homicide, victimization, and offending among white Americans, but that's not the society we live in. And so that issue is important, because what it means is that there is a source of racial inequality within the criminal justice system that goes from that comes from beyond the criminal justice system. It comes from the broader inequalities that we have in our society, the patterns of residential segregation, the unequal access to education, unequal levels of wealth, limited job opportunities for people who live in urban poverty. And so those are the things that we need to address if we want to make Black Americans as safe as white Americans in our society.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, I want people to realize that when I talk about different rates of very serious violent crime among Black Americans, that doesn't mean that that alone explains why we have, if you could go down a little bit, and I'll talk about the infographic there at the bottom.
Yeah.
So that shows the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment in the United States for people born in 2001. So for people who are in their early 20s now. And this is an analysis that was done a while ago. We need to update it, and it's complicated, and we're waiting for that analysis to get done. But so things may look a little bit better now, but at the time that this analysis was done, you can see that men are much more likely than women to experience imprisonment at some point in their lives, and that the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for Black men is 1 in 3. 1 in 3 Black men is going to experience imprisonment at some point in their lives. Young Black men, based on the level of imprisonment that we saw in the year 2000. Things have changed, improved a bit since then, but not dramatically. And so Black men are 6 times as likely as white men to experience imprisonment. Latinx men are 3 times as likely as white men to experience imprisonment. And so similar racial disparities exist for women, though actually a little bit narrower than for men. But so when we look at these disparities, and remember, this is prison that I'm talking about, not jail, not someone who's arrested for a DUI and held shortly, or in a couple months in jail. These are people who are serving 1 year or longer in prison. So this cannot be explained only by racial differences in criminal offending. And we know that very clearly because when we look at crimes like drug crimes, so for example, how often people report using marijuana and possessing marijuana, this ACLU has done great analysis on this. We know that white Americans and Black Americans use drugs such as marijuana at very similar rates. There's almost no difference. And yet Black Americans are much more likely to be arrested for marijuana use, marijuana possession than white Americans. And you see these kinds of disparities for many other kinds of drug offenses. You can see the disparities for property crimes as well, in terms of who is arrested, who do the police stop and search, in terms of how do our sentencing laws treat whites versus Blacks. So there are a number of ways that the criminal justice system introduces racial disparities in outcomes. And another one of those ways is that wealthier people do better in the criminal justice system. They end up less likely to go to prison and likely to go for shorter periods of time if they do go. And what do we know about race and wealth in our society? White Americans are wealthier, and so they're more likely to be able to avoid pretrial detention, more likely to be able to afford a private attorney that can dedicate a lot of resources to helping to alleviate the punishment that they may face. And so in order to eliminate racial disparities in the criminal justice system, we have to do 2 things. We have to address the sources of disparity within the justice system, but that's not going to be enough. We also need to tackle differences in criminal offending when it comes to the most serious violent crimes. And that means looking at issues of housing, education, and so on.
Yeah, all these things that we're talking about keep coming back to these big systemic issues about economics, and really the politics of it and political stereotypes, but systems of how our society functions. And we need to get down to that level and not get hung up on the things that politicians like to talk about to distract us from the hard realities. They like to blame, oh, that guy, and we need to look at systems. Part of the system is political pressures that are put upon legislators, law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, judges, parole boards, and everybody else. And we're running a bit tight on time, but all these entities who have a hand in different parts of the criminal justice system have political pressures on them. And so they tend to bend to those pressures. And so like when we were preparing for the program, you mentioned some of this, and I have a lot of background knowledge on this. When we were on the phone to prepare for this, I mentioned that a prominent, well-known psychiatrist did interviews of people who had retired from jobs as prosecutors, judges, and so forth, who said they know now that they had convicted and sentenced innocent people to death or to long prison sentences or whatever. And now they're able to admit that, but they could not when they were working in a career as a prosecutor or a judge and stuff. And we know legislators feel like the public wants them to be tough on crime because the public is not well informed. And so the legislators feel that kind of pressure. And so this, again, it's a systemic kind of thing. And I wonder, can you add anything to that briefly? And then we need to move on to
Yeah. Yeah, one quick thing I would add to that is the really important role that media plays in this, and the extreme responsibility that journalists and editors have in making sure that crime coverage is accurate. And there's been, studies that show that people of color are overrepresented in crime coverage, that the general public doesn't understand that crime rates have been falling since the 1990s, because when you watch evening news, it always, often will lead with a serious crime story, right? And so people's sense of where we are in terms of crime trends tends to get really skewed as a result of irresponsible news coverage that also doesn't inform people about issues like when people serve decades in prison, they're very unlikely to reoffend. Many people don't realize that, but if we could improve our media coverage on these issues, we would do a better job at holding elected officials accountable to coming up with good policies.
Right, absolutely. In fact, my July 2022 TV program is about how to recognize and counter the bias in mainstream news media. And we mentioned the crime reporting. There's this great slogan in news media editing: if it bleeds, it leads. The lead story, whether it's on a TV thing or a newspaper thing, is some violent crime. And if it bleeds, it leads. And my guest is an expert from a different nonprofit organization that I support. And we really did a number on the systemic bias in the news media, because that does lead to the kind of pressures on the public and the legislators, and it promotes misinformation and actual disinformation, wrong information, so people are misled. And so even when crime has been dropping, the public, based on the media they read and the politicians that they hear from, think that crime is increasing even when it drops. We've been talking about problems. Let's talk about solutions. There are some good solutions out there. And by the way, I want to mention that when we, the program, of course, that we're doing is airing on TV, cable TV in Thurston County, Washington, the county where our state capital, Olympia, is, 3 times a week during August of 2022. I also will post this interview to my blog, parallaxperspectives.org. And along with that, I'll post a thorough summary of what we said during the interview with links to a lot more of the data that we're talking about. So that's powerful stuff. And so if people don't want to watch this on TV, they can read it through the blog and see links to lots of other information as well. So we'll do that. Now let's talk about some solutions. One of the things that's a problem that the last problem that we'll talk about before we look at solutions is this concept of felony murder. And most people probably do not know that term. They might think that's a redundancy, but it really means something different. The term felony murder means that somebody who did not actually commit a murder can still be convicted of a murder if they had any kind of a role in relation to the crime, like a lookout or a driver or something. Can you tell us briefly about felony murder? I know you researched and wrote a great report on this, so you probably have a lot to say, but if you can do it in just a couple of minutes, because we want to move on to solutions.
Yeah, sure thing. So, when I wrote this report on felony murder, I remembered hearing people say, not all murder is murder, just the same way that sometimes people say, not all violent crime is violent. Because sometimes, for example, if you commit a burglary in the evening when someone is expected to be at home, even if no one is in the house, that can be classified as a violent crime because of the possibility of interaction. So sometimes crime classifications don't quite make sense. People have said this about felony murder, that it's not exactly murder. And I had thought, really, is it not, what are we talking about here? And as I looked more closely at it, what I realized is that felony, all murders are a felony, but felony murders are not what we think about as when we think about about murder. It's not an intentional killing, which is typically what murder is. Felony murder is describe something that people have done, which is certainly illegal. So people, for example, engaged in a robbery. And if someone in that group accidentally or intentionally kills the victim, everyone in that group can be convicted of felony murder. And for that person who committed the killing, if it was an accidental killing, let's say they were pointing a gun at someone and then the person tried to hit the gun away and it went off, they will be convicted of felony murder. And in most states, that's treated the same way as murder. And so there's a problem with that, because a very key idea in criminal justice sentencing is proportionality. The worst things that people do should get the worst sentences, and murder is generally considered the worst thing. And yet with felony murder, we see people engaged in very bad and illegal behavior, but not intending to kill. And certainly what they did maybe qualifies as manslaughter in some situations, but it shouldn't be considered murder. And yet it sets them up for a life without parole sentence in many places. So for example, in Washington state, life without parole is a permitted sentence for a felony murder conviction. That's a possibility. And so that's why we at the Sentencing Project recommend repealing felony murder laws and treating those crimes as exactly whatever they are. If the person committed a robbery, if there's a related manslaughter, that's what they should be prosecuted and sentenced for. We shouldn't come up with this fiction of what they did. And the United States is really, again, anomalous in having these statutes on its books that result in very extreme penalties for many people.
Right. And when I post this to my blog, I will include a link to your felony murder report, which I've not yet read, but I will.
Thank you.
Kind of smart information that we need if we're going to solve the problems. And I want to move us next into some solutions. And again, we're tight on time, but I want to cover a bunch of these smart solutions that in many cases people don't know about. We need to certainly solve these systemic problems, the problems in different systems throughout our society that are problematic. One smart solution is what was referred to as a second look. And it's a way to take a second look at sentences that were imposed before, but now they seem excessive. And you know about the second look concept. Can you tell us briefly about that? And then we also have a report that you folks have done that one of your coworkers did, and I'll post the link to that second resentencing report to the blog. But tell us briefly about the second look concept.
Sure. So the idea of second look resentencing is something that has been recommended by legal experts like at the American Law Institute, and it's supported by criminological research. And the idea is that after people have served a period of time in prison, they should be able to petition the courts and say, please take a look at my sentence. Would I be sentenced differently now? Please take a look at the rehabilitation that I can demonstrate that I've achieved during my time of incarceration. Do I deserve a lighter sentence now? Do I deserve to be released at this point? And so currently, very few jurisdictions allow this to happen, but there's a growing movement now to make this a possibility so that we are able to, as the American Law Institute says, look at people who've been sentenced with the microscope and with the information that we have based on evidence of what actually works in sentencing, what helps to reduce crime rates, and based on our changing norms and values. And the changing value of realizing that we've gone overboard with excessive punishment is really important, and second look resentencing laws allow for that to be realized. So for example, one of the best examples of second look laws, I think, is in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. allows people who have served at least 15 years in prison for crimes that they committed under the age of 25 to petition the courts and ask to be resentenced. And over 100 people have been released at this point from prison as a result of this law. They've been tremendously successful in getting reintegrated into our communities and staying safe and not criminally offending again. In Washington state, there is a related law that's modeled after California's second look law. And what that law does is that it allows prosecutors to say, judge, please take a look at this person's case. I think they should be resentenced. So it empowers prosecutors to make that request. Ideally, we would like for people to be able to make that request directly themselves, but it's definitely a start and gets people to realize that there are individuals that are incarcerated, some of whom are really exemplary, that should be reunited with our communities.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned these examples from Washington, D.C., California, and even Washington State. What happens in our country is that some reform pops up somewhere in some state or city, and if it works, then other states or cities will adopt something similar. And once a bunch of places have done this, it spreads. And I know at the state legislative level here in Washington, what they'll do is some idea comes up and they'll say, well, let's see what other states have done this. Oh, Pennsylvania did something, we can learn from them. Oh, Minnesota did something, we can learn from them. And these kinds of things grow. So we need to, whatever location a person lives in who's watching this interview, find out what's going on in your state and see if you can get your state legislature or your county government or city government or whoever to look at successes elsewhere and copy them locally. I want to bring up an image about some other progress that we have made in sentencing. The prison, again, state prison populations by conviction offense. You'll see the top graph line, 2% reduction in violent crimes from violent sentences from violent crimes since 2009. But look at sharper declines of drug and property just in the last few years. Can you tell us about this? And again, briefly, we're tight on time.
Sure thing. So this is a chart that shows the number of people in prison with a violent conviction, that's the top line, and then drug conviction, that's the light green line, and then property crimes on the bottom. And what you can see is that most of the decarceration that's happened in recent years has happened for people with drug or property convictions. The number of people in prison for a violent conviction has not come down very much, only 2% since 2009, even though the violent crime rate was cut in half between the 1990s until the beginning of the pandemic. And yet we did not make a big dent in the number of people in prison for a violent offense.
And again, this is not what you hear about in the mainstream press. They keep, they're pretty much on the bandwagon of, lock them up and throw away the key. And we need people who are watching this interview or reading about it on my blog to send letters to the editor, to contact their elected officials and so forth and say, look, we actually can solve these problems. We've been able to reduce prison population for some kinds of crimes, and we can make some reforms, the kind of reforms that you mentioned and that we will talk about in just a moment. So let's see if we can build a grassroots movement to make further changes. I know one of the things that's been happening is some states are making progress in restoring voting rights after people leave prison. There are a few states that let people vote even while they're in prison. That's better yet. But even after somebody leaves, part of what we need to do if somebody gets out of prison is help them reintegrate into society. And if the state is going to continue holding a grudge against the person and say, okay, you're out of prison now, you've served your sentence, but we're still mad at you and we won't let you vote, all that does is prevent the person from really reintegrating in society and rehabilitating on the outside. So we need to restore voting rights and take away the prohibitions against living in public housing and other kinds of things. So this is interesting. There are some other reforms that we need and solutions. These include better access to defense attorneys, more reasonable ways of dealing with bail. I know some people are making progress on these in different parts of the country where they're trying to find ways to reduce bail, make better access to defense attorney. Can you briefly mention some of that?
Yeah, there's a nationwide movement now to minimize how often people are held pretrial just because they don't have enough money. And when people are held pretrial and they're not a public safety risk, what that ends up doing is that they'll accept a plea offer, often that includes some period of incarceration. And Black Americans and people of color are disproportionately impacted by that. So that's why that's so important. And in terms of voting rights, I just wanted to add that Washington State is among states that have made progress in this area. So just in the past year, the governor signed legislation to allow people to vote when they're on community supervision, when they're on probation or parole. And so that means that the only people that are disenfranchised in the state as a result of contact with the criminal justice system are people who are in prison. So roughly 15,000 people in the state can't vote because they're in prison. And even that we find unacceptable, because states like Vermont and jurisdictions like Washington, D.C. have given people in prison voting rights. And so we would love to see other states moving in that direction to join our peer countries and allow people to maintain their voting rights even while they're incarcerated. There's no reason why people should not be able to vote if they're citizens while they're incarcerated.
Yeah, there's another kind of reform, again, that's kind of systemic and embedded for a long time in our nation here, where certain kinds of crimes and certain kinds of defendants get hard sentences. Some kinds of crimes and some kinds of offenders get light sentences or no sentences. And you think especially of like some big business does some horrible stuff that might make maybe unsafe products that injure or kill people, or they do horrible theft of ripping off customers or fraud or whatever, and they almost never get prison time, even if they rip people off for millions of dollars. But if you go down and hold up a gas station and make a little bit of money, you go to prison. But the corporate executives almost never go to prison. And I just read something a couple of days ago about some profit-making company that owns online charter schools, and they actually ripped off hundreds of millions of dollars, and they got home detention. You know, I mean, there are these kinds of disparities. So I encourage people watching the program or reading about this through my blog to pay attention to these kinds of disparities and see if we can look at, you know, who does more harm to a society, somebody who has stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from fraudulent online charter schools, or somebody who holds up one retail spot, you know.
Yeah, I appreciate your bringing that up. And one addendum I would add to that is that I encourage folks to think about, when it comes to harm, not just who else should we incarcerate and who else deserves incarceration, but how can we prevent the harm from happening in the first place, including for people that are incarcerated? And how can we help people to recover from that harm?
Yeah.
Because when we're talking about especially serious violent crimes, there's no doubt that there's a lot of trauma that leads to those crimes, and it creates a lot of trauma. And unfortunately, one of the things our criminal justice system doesn't do is to provide services and support to victims to recover and heal from that experience. And it's been really notable for me working from the perspective of advancing criminal justice reform to see a number of victim advocacy and survivor advocacy organizations saying, we don't want extreme punishment. That's not what we're asking for. That's not what we need for our recovery. We want policies that prevent the crime from happening in the first place, and we want help to restore ourselves after it's happened. And so we really need to make sure to elevate those voices as well.
Yeah, we have giant corporations, oil companies, pipeline companies, plastic manufacturing companies that have caused cancer, water pollution, all kinds of horrible stuff that causes people to get cancer, causes people to die. Those corporate executives never get held accountable in any way. And I just yesterday read an article about how, although we have laws protecting consumers from unsafe products, federal law explicitly prohibits accountability for holding gun manufacturers accountable for their unsafe products that kill many, many, many people. And no, Congress says, no, you can't hold them accountable. Let's look at the big picture. Let's look at who are the big, rich, powerful capitalist entities that are above the law. So we need to look at that too. On every issue, I want to get into some other things here. On every issue that we discuss in this TV series, I always encourage the public to inform themselves and consider their best values to urge smart solutions, including better public policies. And our current problems exist partly because of public ignorance and partly because of mean-spiritedness on the part of people who have power. And if we inform ourselves and practice wisdom and compassion, we can urge our elected officials to create better public policies. And I've talked with state legislators a lot about things, and they sometimes they seem pretty clueless, or they feel like they're constrained. Oh, I can't get away with doing politically, I can't get away with doing what you're asking, but we'll do maybe a little bit, like, no, we need to do better. And when we were preparing for the interview, you mentioned something that I said before, that some people in positions of power have put their jobs and careers ahead of real justice and fairness and stuff. So we need to keep lifting up better values and urging people. I want to talk about briefly the organization that you work for, because I really have supported the Sentencing Project for a long time. I've been enjoying giving significant financial support, and I'm happy to see it's being well used with the work that you've been doing, and Ashley and Nellis that wrote this other report that I mentioned. When I decided to conduct this TV interview about this topic, I've done a number of programs over the years on these kinds of issues. I contacted the Sentencing Project this time around and said, provide me a well-informed guest, and they provided you. And so I'm delighted with that. I hope people will support the Sentencing Project. Their website is www.sentencingproject.org, and I'll have information about you in my blog. Can you tell us briefly about the Sentencing Project and the work specifically that you do there?
Sure. The Sentencing Project has been around for over 30 years, and we advocate and do research in support of a more fair and effective criminal justice system. We try to tackle racial disparities, gender disparities. We work with local advocates, state level advocates, to disseminate our research. We testify at legislatures. We engage in a lot of public education through conversations like this. We also try to work with criminal justice practitioners to get them educated about the broader patterns at issue with their work. And so we invite everyone to come visit our website, get educated about these issues, get involved, because it's only through that process that we can build a broad and informed public movement to end mass incarceration.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I do encourage people to learn more. This stuff is fascinating, and I've been working on these kinds of things for decades. Most people do not know enough. The news media do not inform us well enough, and the politicians, as a result, are not well informed enough. And we need to move them to get better information and practice smarter public policies with compassion and other better values. When I post information to my blog, I'll provide the link again to this organization and some other good organizations that we don't have time for me to mention now. This will be on my blog, parallaxperspectives.org. Parallax has one R and two L's in it, Parallax perspectives.org. I'll post this to the TV programs part and to the criminal justice part of my blog. And we'll have the video here, and also a thorough summary of what we said. The thorough summary, I'll include links to lots more information that we did not have time to discuss. I want to thank Nazgul Gandnoush for sharing her information and insights. I want to thank the people who've been watching this interview. I often hear people say that you can tell how civilized a society is by seeing how they treat the people at the bottom rungs of society. And people who commit crimes are stuck onto the bottom rungs of society. So to improve society, we need to understand the processes that put people there, and we need to reform the processes so those rungs are not so far down, and so that people can be helped off the bottom rungs and rejoin society, so that all together we'll be a better society with everybody included, with fairness. I hope that we will be applying wisdom, information, compassion to public policy issues, so that we can solve the systemic problems beyond the ones that we've talked about specifically here, because the problems really are systemic and huge. But we can make progress, as we've talked about a little bit toward the end of this interview. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. You can also phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create the better world, but we all have to work at it. So thanks for doing whatever you can. And thank you also.
Thank you for this great conversation.
Okay, good.
All right.
Good, thanks.